In the new investigative podcast, Murderville, senior reporters at The Intercept, Liliana Segura and Jordan Smith, examine the systemic failures that lead to wrongful convictions. Season 1 of the podcast was released in 2019, focused on Georgia. Season 2, which is now being produced, takes the host to Texas, where they investigate a disturbing crime, a startling confession, and a story that doesn't quite add up. Here to tell us more are senior reporters at The Intercept, Liliana Segura and Jordan Smith. Welcome to you both.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that was an exciting little tease. Liliana, what more can you tell us about it?
Well, there's a lot to this case. I mean, you're absolutely right that the point of of this project and of this podcast has always been about shining a light not only on an individual case, but using that case as a vehicle for revealing all the ways in which the flaws in the criminal justice system can lead to innocent people being locked up for crimes they didn't commit. In this case, this case involves a man named Charles Raby, who's actually on Texas death row for a crime that he confessed to. This dates back to 1992. An elderly woman named Edna Franklin was found brutally murdered in her home in Houston, and sort of very quickly, police, all eyes turned on this young man named Charles Raby, who, it's not giving anything away to say, he pretty quickly confessed to the crime. And so, you know, from afar, it's easy to say, well, open and shut, you know, that sort of settles that. But in fact, there were a lot of reasons to question that confession. And so our project takes a look at a lot of the paths that weren't taken investigatively, and also the nature of confessions themselves and on all the ways in which they can become corrupted.
And Jordan, from my listening of this so far, it's fascinating because like Liliana says, there's a confession. So you're like, okay, well, I guess we're going to move on from this and move on to some gray areas where we can really, start to probe. But then you look closer into it and you're like, wait, this guy looks pretty clearly like he didn't do it, like almost certainly that he didn't do it, and that there's no evidence that he did other than the fact that he said he did it. So A, it's stunning that he's still on death row, but B, what made you pick this particular case, and what can it tell us about confessions?
Well, I think the reason that we took this case and tackled that first is it's a Texas case from a very particular time in the early 90s. And I've reported on the death penalty in Texas for more than 2 decades. And when this one came across my desk, it was kind of like, yep, it's got all the things. Texas was very aggressively pursuing death penalty sentences in the 90s in particular, 80s and 90s, and nowhere more than Harris County, which is where Houston is. And, Houston has actually sent more people to death row in Texas than most states have. So they were very aggressive in pursuing the death penalty, even when there was incredibly thin evidence. You also have to look at it in the backdrop of crime is very high in Houston right then. And so the cops are just sort of scrambling. So you have this terrible sort of scenario where you have cops that are just sort of trying to close cases as fast as they can, and then prosecutors who are like hell-bent on sending these people to death row. Meanwhile, on the flip side, you have defense lawyers who just are not up to the task. There were very few standards in Texas in those days for who could defend a capital case. So it's a perfect storm for a wrongful conviction. Now, when you put the confession in there, it makes it even easier for this sort of system to do what it does, right? Because the cops who are overburdened are like, this guy confessed. Cool, we're done. Send it over to the Harris County DA's office. They're like, cool, a confession, we're done, and the lawyers are like, oh God, we have a confession, what do we do? So, you can see how it's very easy that someone ends up on death row in this scenario, in this particular time frame. I think the piece about the confessions that plays into this also is that people generally think, I would never confess to something I didn't do. Maybe other people do it, but I certainly would never do that. And certainly not somewhere where the stakes are so high, right? But what we know and what science tells us and what history tells us is that people confess for any number of reasons to things that they didn't do, even incredibly high stakes scenarios. I mean, if you look at the National Registry of Exonerations, to date, there are hundreds of exonerations that feature a false confession, including more than 24 that were death cases. So I think the idea is to sort of illuminate the system that churns people, to sort of doesn't do justice, to sort of churns them into the system. And then also the questionable science that goes into those convictions, and try to show people how this happens.
Yeah, people don't understand how intense police interrogations can be. That when you're you're interrogated for hours and hours and hours, you get you're suggestible. You want to. The police can create a scenario where you want to give them the information that they're looking for, even if you don't have it. As you end up, your brain ends up, making things up. You're filling in connections that don't exist because of the discomfort of the situation. Was something like that, Liliana, an element of what was going on here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and it seems clear. First of all, that question was obviously at the heart of what of our investigation from the jump. One sort of perverse aspect of this particular case is this is an error where the Houston Police Department actually did record interrogations of suspects when it came to robberies, but when it came to murders, they didn't record their interrogations. We don't have a recording. We don't have a transcript. We actually have no idea what actually happened in that room. And so, as you mentioned, the sort of interrogation tactics that can lead a suspect to try to please their interrogators, to try to get out of a situation, to try to, the leading questions that can kind of come to form a false confession. We're very clearly at play, but we really can't know for sure what exactly happened. We can say that Charles Raby, what he has described is something, an element of confessions that actually a lot of people don't fully appreciate. Not only do people not really believe, many people still, that people wouldn't confess to something they didn't do, but there is a subset of confessions, of false confessions, in which people actually come to believe and come to doubt whether or not they actually might have done this thing. And Charles Raby absolutely fits into that category, and that's one of the sort of weirder aspects of this case. For a long time, Charles Raby was walking around not knowing whether he did this or not. And that goes to the heart of, the kind of interrogation techniques that were used. Also, the fact that he was not entirely sober, the fact that he had a criminal record, that he was the kind of person who had committed violent acts in the past. So they seized on these kinds of aspects of a person's history, and there's so sort of internal sense of self-esteem or identity to kind of exploit those weaknesses.
Jordan, in your investigations through all of this, what would you say is the number one thing that could change in order to kind of fix some of these systemic failures?
Where to start? To the confession situation, there's a very easy fix, which is require that all interrogations be recorded from stem to stern, from the minute you walk in the room until the minute that you walk out of the room. That has long been a very easy fix, and it's one that states and jurisdictions have just resisted. And as Liliana said, we know that they had the recording equipment, but they chose not to use it on homicide suspects. And you have to wonder about that. I mean, Texas jurisdictions have really resisted recording interrogations, and that's, it obviously varies throughout the states and by jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but that's a really easy fix, but it's like a really small fix, but it would help. I mean, there are far larger systemic problems that, how long do you have, right, to go over them? But I think, in Texas, the system has kind of started to correct itself a little bit in that, prosecutors just aren't seeking death cases as often, and juries just aren't handing it out. But that's not because of anything that the state has done to correct the problems in the system. And it doesn't account for the fact of, dozens and hundreds of people that are still sitting on death row, not only in Texas, but across the country during these eras where there are very few rules. So, it's not something that can easily be solved, unfortunately.
And Liliana, you talk about the clock ticking for Charles Raby. What's next for him? What has to happen for him not to be executed for this crime that it appears almost certainly not to have committed?
That's a good question too. I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but once you listen to the full podcast episode, there are some measures that his lawyers are hoping to pursue that could, at the very least, delay any execution date being set, but actually, more significantly, could also reveal further evidence of his innocence. And I won't go too much farther than that, but I think it stands to another sort of takeaway from this whole story, which applies to the system across the board, is the courts should be the ones that should represent a sort of stopgap, a protective measure against sending innocent people to the execution chamber. But we see over and over and over again in Texas and other places that isn't how it works. And so I hope that anyone who does listen to the series pays attention to what we have to say about the courts, especially in Texas, because that's a real crisis and without an easy answer.
Well, so it's called Murderville. The first season is great. That one takes place in Georgia. The second season is great so far. Congratulations to both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
And we will have more Rising right after this. Stick around.